1. Hannah Ocuish. She was just 12 years old, a child by every definition, and yet, on December 20th, 1786, Hannah Ocuish stood at the gallows in New London, Connecticut. A rope was placed around her neck. Moments later, she became the youngest person ever executed in American history. Hannah was of mixed Pequot Native American descent and mentally impaired, described in colonial records as half-witted. She lived in poverty, faced severe marginalization, and had little understanding of the society that ultimately condemned her. The victim, 6-year-old Eunice Bowles, had accused Hannah of stealing strawberries earlier that year. Weeks later, Eunice vanished. Her body was found in the woods, beaten, strangled, and hidden beneath stones. The colonial court system responded swiftly. Hannah confessed to the crime, but her confession raised questions even then. It was inconsistent, and many believed she was manipulated into giving it. Nonetheless, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. There were no psychological evaluations, no consideration of her age or mental state, no appeal. The crowd that gathered to watch her execution treated it like a public event. Even in death, she was stripped of dignity. The case is now often cited as a horrifying example of colonial injustice, where a child with intellectual disabilities, belonging to a marginalized group, was tried and punished as an adult. There was no space for mercy. No thought that a girl of 12 might have been a victim long before she became an offender. Today, Hannah Ocuish's name is largely absent from mainstream history books, but her story lingers in the margins, a ghostly reminder of how the scales of justice once tilted without remorse. She had no defense, no second chance, no understanding of the world that sentenced her. More than 2 centuries later, her case still echoes, not just for its brutality, but for what it says about the dangers of blind justice. She wasn't a monster. She was a child. And in the end, it wasn't just one little girl who was killed in the woods. It was 2. 2. Paula Cooper. In 1986, the city of Gary, Indiana, became the epicenter of a legal and moral storm that would echo across the globe. At the center of it was a teenage girl, Paula Cooper, just 15 years old when she committed a crime that would place her on death row. A year later, at age 16, she became the youngest person in the United States to be sentenced to death in the modern era. The crime was brutal. Paula and 3 other teenage girls skipped school and went to the home of 78-year-old Bible teacher Ruth Pelkey. Armed with a knife, Paula stabbed the elderly woman 33 times during a robbery that yielded a mere $10 and a stolen car. The savagery of the attack shocked even seasoned investigators. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the senselessness, the rage, the youth. During the trial, Paula pleaded guilty. The courtroom heard of her traumatic past, physical abuse, sexual assault, a home life fractured by drugs and violence. Her lawyers argued that she was a product of chaos, not evil. But the judge focused on the viciousness of the act. In July 1986, Paula Cooper was sentenced to death by electric chair. The world reacted. Protests erupted. Over 2 million people signed a petition calling for her life to be spared, including Pope John Paul II. Critics questioned how a country that barred juveniles from voting or drinking could sentence one to death. The case reignited global debates about capital punishment, juvenile justice, and redemption. In 1989, the Indiana Supreme Court overturned the death sentence, ruling that it was unconstitutional to execute anyone for a crime committed under the age of 16. Paula's sentence was commuted to 60 years in prison. In 2013, after serving 27 years, she was released on parole at the age of 43. But the story didn't end there. Less than 2 years later, in 2015, Paula Cooper died by suicide. She had struggled to adjust to life outside, burdened by trauma, infamy, and decades of institutionalization. Her release had symbolized redemption. Her death became a footnote in a larger, darker narrative. Paula Cooper's case remains one of the most powerful examples of the intersection between justice and mercy, between accountability and compassion. She was both a killer and a child, and the world didn't quite know what to do with that contradiction. In the end, her story asks a haunting question. Can someone who's been broken from the start ever be truly rebuilt, or does the system just finish what life began? 3. Emilia Carr. In the quiet rural stretches of Marion County, Florida, a twisted love triangle turned deadly and left a 24-year-old woman on death row. Emilia Carr was young, educated, and came from a large family with deep roots in the community. But behind her soft-spoken demeanor was a storm of jealousy, manipulation, and a need for control that culminated in one of the most chilling murders Florida had seen in years. The year was 2009. Emilia had recently broken off an engagement with a man named Joshua Fulgham. But the breakup didn't bring closure. Joshua had moved on to Heather Strong, a woman he soon married. Emilia didn't take it well. What began as resentment soon escalated into full-blown obsession. Emilia and Joshua rekindled their physical relationship, even as he remained married to Heather. That triangle would soon spiral into something far darker. On February 15, 2009, Heather Strong vanished. Investigators learned that she had been lured to a storage trailer on property owned by Emilia's family. There, in a horrifying twist, she was bound to a chair, suffocated with a plastic bag, and left to die. The killers? Joshua Fulgham and Emilia Carr. Surveillance footage, cell phone records, and Emilia's own shifting stories led police straight to the pair. When confronted, Emilia initially denied everything. Then she confessed. Her version painted a portrait of a woman torn between love and manipulation. She claimed Joshua had forced her to help. But the details she provided, how Heather begged for her life, how Emilia held the bag over her head, left no room for doubt. This wasn't a moment of panic. It was methodical. It was personal. It was murder. In 2011, Emilia Carr was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping. At just 26 years old, she was sentenced to death, becoming the youngest woman on death row in the United States at the time. Her co-defendant and former fiancé, Joshua Fulgham, received life without parole. The trial exposed the emotional volatility that marked Emilia's life. Witnesses described her history of manipulation, deception, and emotional abuse. Yet others noted her intelligence, her devotion to her children, and her apparent regret. It was a portrait of contradictions, of a woman capable of nurturing and annihilation in equal measure. In 2017, Emilia's death sentence was overturned on appeal due to procedural errors during jury selection. She was resentenced to life in prison without parole. She remains behind bars to this day, a reminder of how obsession can warp into something irreversible. The story of Emilia Carr is not just about a crime of passion. It's about power, betrayal, and the capacity for cruelty that can hide beneath ordinary surfaces. She was once a daughter, a mother, a fiancée. But in the end, she became something else entirely, a young woman whose desire for control led to a final act of devastating permanence. For Christa Pike. In the dark corners of juvenile crime history, few names evoke the same level of horror and disbelief as Christa Pike. At just 18 years old, she became the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States in the modern era. Her case defined by a level of brutality that stunned even seasoned investigators. The year was 1995. Christa Pike was a troubled teen enrolled in the Job Corps program in Knoxville, Tennessee, a government initiative designed to give disadvantaged young people job training and life skills. That's where she met Colleen Slemmer, a fellow student, and began a toxic rivalry, rooted in jealousy, manipulation, and control. Christa believed Colleen was trying to pursue her boyfriend, Caril Ship. Whether that was true or not didn't matter, because what followed was pure calculated violence. On the night of January 12, 1995, Christa lured Colleen to a secluded area near the University of Tennessee's agriculture campus under the pretense of making peace. Instead, Colleen was ambushed by Christa, Caril, and another student named Shadola Peterson. What unfolded was a 30-minute ordeal of sadism. Colleen was tortured, stabbed, slashed, and beaten with a piece of asphalt. Christa even carved a pentagram into her chest and ultimately delivered the fatal blow, a large chunk of concrete to the skull. The most chilling detail? Christa later bragged about the murder to fellow students, even showing off a piece of Colleen's skull she had kept as a souvenir in her jacket pocket. Her remorseless attitude shocked peers, faculty, and eventually the entire country. When authorities searched her room, they found detailed notes about the crime and satanic writings, evidence that erased any doubt about her involvement or her intent. Her trial was swift. In 1996, Christa Pike was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Her co-defendant, Caril, was 17 at the time and received life in prison due to his age. Peterson cooperated with prosecutors and served time before being released. Over the years, Christa has shown no signs of remorse. In 2001, she was caught attempting to murder a fellow inmate using a shoelace. She's since remained in solitary confinement for most of her incarceration. Appeals and legal efforts have delayed her execution, but her death sentence still stands. What makes Christa Pike's case so disturbing isn't just her age. It's the cold, methodical cruelty of her actions and the absence of empathy before, during, and after the crime. Her case forced the public to confront a difficult question. Can a teenager be so morally broken that death is the only fitting punishment? Today, Christa Pike remains the only woman on Tennessee's death row. Her story is a haunting testament to the darkness that can exist even in the young, and a chilling reminder that age does not always equal innocence. 5. Cyntoia Brown. In 2004, 16-year-old Cyntoia Brown was arrested and charged with the murder of a 43-year-old man in Tennessee. What unfolded in court was a case that would ignite national debate, one that blurred the lines between guilt and survival, crime and trauma. Raised in an unstable environment, Cyntoia had endured a turbulent childhood. Her early life was marked by neglect, instability, and exposure to harmful influences. At the time of the incident, she was under the control of an older man who exploited her vulnerability. She had been living on the streets, navigating a world far too dangerous for someone her age. On the night of the incident, she accompanied a man to his home. According to Cyntoia, she feared for her safety and believed her life was in danger. In a moment of panic, she used a firearm and fled the scene. Law enforcement later apprehended her, and prosecutors charged her with first-degree murder and robbery. Despite her age and the troubling circumstances surrounding her life, she was tried as an adult. In 2006, Cyntoia Brown was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Under Tennessee law at the time, this meant she would not be eligible for parole until serving at least 51 years. For many, this raised serious ethical questions. Was the system treating her fairly? Was enough consideration given to the trauma she had experienced and the environment that shaped her decisions? Her story gained widespread attention years later through a documentary that exposed the complexity of her case. Viewers were introduced to not just the crime, but the girl behind it, the systemic failures, the abuse, the lack of intervention when she needed it most. Public support grew rapidly. Activists, legal experts, and high-profile figures began advocating for a second look at her sentence. They argued that Cyntoia was more than her worst moment, that her life had been shaped by forces beyond her control, and that her case highlighted a much larger issue within the justice system: how it treats abused and vulnerable youth. In prison, Cyntoia showed remarkable growth. She earned her GED, obtained a college degree, and became a mentor to other incarcerated women. In 2019, after serving 15 years, her sentence was commuted by the governor of Tennessee. She walked free, having served the most formative years of her life behind bars. Today, Cyntoia Brown Long is an author, advocate, and speaker. Her case remains one of the most discussed examples of juvenile justice in modern America. It forces society to ask, how do we treat children who have been hurt and who then hurt others? Where should accountability end and compassion begin? Her story reminds us that justice should be more than punishment. It should be a search for truth, context, and the possibility of redemption. 6. Sara Kruzan. Sara Kruzan was only 16 years old when she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her case would become one of the most powerful examples of how the justice system often fails to account for trauma, abuse, and survival, especially when it comes to young girls. Born in Riverside, California, Sara grew up surrounded by instability. She was raised by a single mother who struggled with her own mental health. And from a young age, Sara was subjected to abuse that left deep psychological scars. At just 11 years old, she was groomed by a man named George Howard, a known trafficker who preyed on vulnerable girls. By the time she was a teenager, Sara had been manipulated and exploited by Howard for years. She lived in a world most adults couldn't even imagine. trapped in a cycle of fear, control, and silence. In March 1994, at age 16, she met Howard at a motel. That night, Sara shot and killed him. She would later say she was terrified and believed there was no other way out. Despite being a minor and a victim of trafficking, Sara was tried as an adult. The court paid little attention to her history of abuse or the fact that she had been groomed and manipulated from childhood. In 1995, she was sentenced to life without parole. The sentence stunned many, but it wasn't until years later that her story gained national attention. As public awareness around human trafficking grew, so did outrage about Sara's case. Advocates argued that she should have been protected, not punished. Her story became a rallying cry for juvenile justice reform. While behind bars, Sara didn't give up. She earned her diploma, became a model inmate, and began using her voice to speak out about the realities of abuse and exploitation. In 2011, after nearly 2 decades in prison, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger commuted her sentence to 25 years to life with the possibility of parole. Then, in 2013, Governor Jerry Brown granted her full release. Sara walked out of prison after 19 years. Today, she is an advocate, public speaker, and the founder of a nonprofit that helps young survivors of trauma and exploitation. Her journey, from victim to prisoner to activist, continues to inspire reform in how the justice system handles youth, abuse survivors, and the gray areas where survival and crime collide. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. When a child is forced into a life they never chose, how do we respond when they fight back? Should a lifetime behind bars ever be the answer for a teenage girl who never had a chance? Sara Kruzan didn't just survive her past, she transformed it into purpose. Number 7. Rosie Alfaro. In 1990, a 23-year-old woman named Rosie Alfaro entered the home of 9-year-old Autumn Wallace in Anaheim, California. Her intention was robbery, but what followed shocked the state and the nation. Rosie, a heroin addict desperate for money to fuel her addiction, stabbed the young girl over 50 times with a kitchen knife. Autumn had been home alone, waiting for her older sister to return. Rosie, who knew the family, had knocked on the door pretending to need to use the bathroom. Once inside, she brutally attacked the child and left her to die. Rosie Alfaro's crime was not only vicious, but chilling in its lack of remorse. At trial, she admitted to the killing and showed little emotion throughout. Her defense cited her addiction, her troubled childhood, and her long history of abuse and neglect. But none of it could erase what she had done. The jury found her guilty of first-degree murder, and in 1992, she became the first woman in Orange County to be sentenced to death. Rosie remains on California's death row to this day. Her case stirred deep conversations about addiction, poverty, and the line between personal responsibility and societal failure. But for the Wallace family, none of those debates can undo the horror of that day. Autumn's parents never got to see their daughter grow up. And Rosie's descent from a neglected child to a death row inmate became a cautionary tale of how far someone can fall, and how quickly a life can be destroyed by a single desperate act. 8. Virginia Christian. In 1912, Virginia Christian, a 17-year-old African-American maid, was executed in the state of Virginia. Her case remains one of the most haunting examples of race, class, and the death penalty colliding in the early 20th century. Virginia was accused of killing her employer, Ida Belote, a white woman who had reportedly abused and humiliated her. According to court records, the confrontation turned violent when Belote allegedly shoved Christian and struck her with a spittoon. In a moment of panic and rage, Virginia retaliated, hitting Belote, stuffing a towel in her mouth, and leaving her to suffocate. Despite her young age and the highly charged social context of the time, Virginia was tried as an adult. The trial lasted less than a day. The all-white, all-male jury found her guilty, and the judge sentenced her to death by electrocution. Her mother, who had been enslaved before emancipation, pleaded for clemency. So did community members who believed Virginia had acted out of fear, not premeditation. But Governor William Mann refused to commute her sentence. On August 16, 1912, Virginia Christian was executed at the state penitentiary in Richmond. She was the first and remains the only female juvenile to be executed in Virginia. Her case reveals the harsh reality of a legal system that gave little weight to youth, trauma, or circumstance, especially when the accused was poor and black. Virginia's story faded from the public memory for decades, buried beneath a history of racial injustice. But in recent years, her name has resurfaced in discussions about criminal justice reform and the role of systemic bias. She died without ever having a voice in her own defense. Her life and death stand as a chilling reminder. In the eyes of early 20th century justice, even a 17-year-old girl could be deemed beyond redemption if her skin was the wrong color and her birth the wrong class. Kristina Fetters. Kristina Fetters was only 14 years old when she was arrested in 1994 for the murder of her great-aunt, 73-year-old Arlene Claim, in Des Moines, Iowa. Kristina had a troubled history. She was diagnosed with mental illness and had been placed in a psychiatric facility shortly before the crime. But on the night of the murder, she ran away, broke into her great-aunt's home, and fatally attacked her. The brutal nature of the crime shocked the community, and prosecutors wasted no time charging her as an adult. By 15, Kristina was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She became Iowa's youngest female inmate to receive such a sentence. Her case was rarely mentioned in the media for years, until the tides of juvenile justice began to shift. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional. That decision opened the door for Kristina's case to be reviewed. At the time, she had already spent nearly 2 decades behind bars, and something else had changed. Kristina had been diagnosed with inoperable breast cancer. She was dying. As her health rapidly declined, her legal team petitioned the court for compassionate release. In 2013, after serving 19 years, Kristina became the first Iowa inmate to be resentenced under the Miller ruling. She was granted parole and released into hospice care, where she spent her final months outside prison walls. She died less than a year later, at just 34 years old. Kristina Fetters' case became a flashpoint in the national debate over juvenile sentencing. Supporters argued that no child, no matter how serious the crime, should be condemned to die in prison. Others maintained that her release, even in failing health, was a dangerous precedent. But for many advocates, Kristina represented something deeper, a broken girl punished as if she were already beyond repair. Her story raises a haunting question. What is justice when a child commits an unforgivable act? And if that child is sick, mentally unstable, and growing up in a prison cell, are they still the same person decades later? Kristina Fetters never returned to society in any real sense, but in the end the system showed her a measure of mercy, too late for her to live, but just in time for her to die free. Let me know when you're ready for the final section. 10. Caril and Fugate. In 1958, America was gripped by fear as a teenage couple blazed across the Midwest on a killing spree that left 11 people dead. At the center of the chaos was 19-year-old Charles Starkweather and his 14-year-old girlfriend, Caril and Fugate. Their story shocked the nation, not just for its violence, but for the mystery surrounding Caril's role. Was she a willing accomplice or a terrified girl held hostage? It all began in Lincoln, Nebraska. Starkweather, already obsessed with rebellion and violence, had been dating Caril for a year. On January 21st, after an argument with her family, Starkweather shot and killed Caril's mother, stepfather, and baby half-sister. What happened next has been the subject of debate for over 6 decades. Starkweather claimed Caril was a partner in crime. Caril insisted she had been held captive and feared for her life. The pair fled town, embarking on an 8-day rampage that included the murders of a wealthy couple, a traveling salesman, and a teenage boy. They were finally arrested in Wyoming, where Starkweather was sentenced to death, and Caril to life in prison. At just 14 years old, Caril became the youngest female in U.S. history to be sentenced to life imprisonment at that time. Her age, combined with her claims of coercion, sparked widespread controversy. Supporters believed she had been brainwashed by an older, violent boyfriend. Detractors saw her as a manipulative killer hiding behind her youth. Over time, Caril's sentence was reduced, and she was released after serving 18 years. She moved away, married, and tried to live a quiet life. But her past never faded. Books, films, and documentaries kept the story alive, some painting her as a victim, others as a villain. To this day, people are divided. Was Caril a child manipulated by a dangerous man, or did she know exactly what she was doing? The courts decided she bore enough responsibility to deserve life behind bars, but the world remains uncertain. Caril Ann Fugate's story remains one of the most chilling and debated cases of youth sentencing in American history. Her age, the nature of the crimes, and her insistence on innocence challenge our understanding of guilt, manipulation, and fear. And for many, she is the face of a haunting question. How young is too young to know right from wrong, when the price is life behind bars? They weren't hardened criminals when they were sentenced. Many weren't even old enough to drive, vote, or legally consent. Yet their punishments rivaled the harshest sentences the justice system can offer. Death, or a lifetime behind bars with no promise of ever walking free again. From Hannah Ocuish, executed at just 12 years old in Colonial Connecticut, to Christa Pike, still awaiting death on Tennessee's death row. These cases aren't just about crime, they're about the system's definition of justice. They force us to confront how the law draws the line between accountability and cruelty, between protecting society and abandoning the youngest among us. Some of these girls were shaped by unimaginable abuse. Some were lost in addiction, manipulation, or poverty. Others made choices so violent that even age couldn't shield them from the gavel's full force. But in nearly every case, trauma, race, circumstance, or desperation played a part. When a child kills, the question isn't just what she did, but why, and whether justice means punishing her as an adult or protecting the broken child behind the crime. Paula Cooper's death sentence at 16 caused a global outcry. Cyntoia Brown's life sentence triggered a national movement. Kristina Fetters spent her last years dying in a prison hospital after being locked away at 14. These aren't just legal cases, they are moral indictments. So what does it mean when the system looks at a child and sees no possibility of redemption? When it says, "You will never be free." Justice must protect the innocent, but it should also recognize when the guilty were once victims too. Do we execute the guilty or the broken? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Like this video if you learned something new. Subscribe for more true crime stories that dig deeper than the headlines. And tell us, should the justice system ever give up on children?